next speaker now is Professor Pierre PÉNET, who is a research fellow at the CNRS and professor at the ENS Paris-Saclay. He will be speaking about Odious depth in the 21st century. And thank you so much, Professor PÉNET, for joining us. And you can share your screen.
Thank you, Paulius, for your introduction. Thank you, Sadie, for inviting me back. So I'm going to be working on a new project at the Institute. The project is called Odious in the 21st century. It's something that I've been thinking about and developing for quite a while now, going all the way back to my dissertation research, actually, about 15 years ago. So it's been a while. Some of the early work came out in a volume on sovereign debt, which I co-edited after my first stay at the Institute. So not my first time here, second time. Thank you again, Sadie, for inviting me back. I look forward to your comments. Debt is a complicated matter, so I want to start with a very simple question. The simple question is this: when and under what conditions can a country walk away from its debt? It's a question that has been hanging over global finance for decades, for centuries even. It's especially relevant right now because we are experiencing a global debt crisis. As we speak, and you can look at the map on the slide, in the slide, 21 countries are in default as we speak. Many others, especially in the global south, are heavily indebted and they're struggling to repay their debt. Now, historically speaking, most defaults happen out of necessity because countries can't pay and because they're bankrupt. But what if a country refuses to pay, not because it's bankrupt, but because it believes the debt itself is illegitimate and unfair? Well, that's where the idea of odious debt comes in. The doctrine of odious debt is based on a simple but very powerful idea. If a debt was contracted under illegitimate conditions, well, the state shouldn't be legally obligated to pay it back. So before I go into the details, I just want to say very briefly why I think this doctrine is meaningful and important for us. First, odious debt is one of the only legal tools that we have to bring some order into a very messy world. There is no global bankruptcy process for states. So it means when a country runs into financial trouble, there is no clear framework. Creditors push for repayment. Debtors try to resist the countries, and both sides use every legal and political tactic they can to gain the upper hand. And usually, ordinary citizens are the ones who pay the price. So odious debt is valuable because it offers one of the few legal principles that can introduce some kind of order into this chaos. That's the first reason. The second reason is odious debt pushes back against the dominant idea that debts must always be repaid, no matter the cost, no matter what. It reminds us that the law, international law, doesn't automatically side with creditors. And in that sense, odious debt acts as a kind of legal counterculture. It challenges the supremacy of creditors in the global financial system. And that's why I think also this is a second reason I think it's very important to have in mind. So a little bit of history. The doctrine of odious debt was first formulated in 1927. I think we're going to talk about anniversaries in the next presentation. Well, it's almost a century. It will be a century in 2 years. The doctrine was formulated in 1927 by Alexander Sack. Sack was a Russian jurist based in Paris. And he became famous for that, he argued that in certain cases, states are entitled to repudiate their debt. And SAC laid out 3 criteria. Those are the criteria that you see on the slide. So first, the debt must have been incurred by a despotic government. That's the first criteria. The money must have been used to finance programs that run counter to the population's interests. Second criteria. And finally, creditors must have been aware of the above 2 conditions. That's the third criteria. Now, there's a lasting debate. I'm going to cut a very long story short, but there is a lasting debate among legal historians between those who argue that all 3 conditions must be met, and those, well, like me, who support a looser and more flexible application. And as we are going to see, the approach you choose fundamentally shapes how the doctrine is interpreted, applied, and also what kind of impact it can have. The first classic case, I'm going to stay a little bit in history and I will move forward to discuss more recent cases. The first classic case is Cuba. After defeating Spain in 1898, the US refused to let the new Cuban Republic inherit Spain's colonial debts. Why? Well, because of the 3 criteria I just talked about. First, the debts were contracted without the people's consent. They had been used to suppress Cuban independence movements. And 3, creditors knew exactly what they were doing. Cuba is an important starting point for the doctrine. This classical formula has been used and has been influential in other cases of state succession after colonial rule in Algeria, for instance, in 1962. More recently, in 2003, the doctrine, the Odious debt doctrine was cited again, this time in Iraq, to cancel the debts accumulated under Saddam Hussein. This wasn't a courtroom battle. It's important to understand. The doctrine was used by US diplomats, not lawyers. And there was a fair bit of political strategy involved. Iraq's biggest creditors were France and Russia, 2 countries that had opposed the US invasion, if you remember, 2003. And so by labeling Iraq's debt odious, the US administration found a convenient way to punish their behavior at the UN. So that was part of the story. But the doctrine was cited, and today the doctrine is still alive, and that's very good news. But my idea is this: if we keep applying it to only cases like Iraq and more recently Ukraine, it will most likely remain marginal, because first, it will come too late after the damage is done, after a country defaults, after the despotic regime falls. And second, this definition is limited to despotic regimes only, and that significantly limits its relevance today, because many debt crises in the global south today involve democratically elected governments without a despot involved. And that's why many researchers are calling for restatement to make the doctrine more relevant in the 21st century. 2 shifts are underway. The first is about making odious debt a market issue, a market norm. The goal here is to make investors, creditors, internalize the risk of illegitimate debts, so that the doctrine would be applied proactively, preemptively, without the need to litigate. That's the first move. The second move is to shift the focus from borrowers to lenders. Rather than focusing on despotic regimes, the doctrine could help identify and hold accountable odious lenders, the banks, those who knowingly issue harmful and unsustainable loans. And together, these 2 processes could breathe new life into the doctrine and turn it into a more proactive instrument for financial accountability. And that's the rest of my talk. I think I have time. So the first restatement, the first idea that I'm developing in my paper, instead of waiting for a regime to fall or default to happen, we could try to make odious debt part of investors' risk assessments, so that, in a way, so that market actors actually think twice before financing repressive regimes. That's the first idea. This idea actually gained traction after Ricardo Hausmann, a Harvard economist, wrote an op-ed in 2017 explaining that the Maduro regime in Venezuela was despotic and that banks buying its bonds were complicit. The interesting thing in question that we have to have in mind is that the bonds in question, the so-called hunger bonds, dropped in value the very next day after the op-ed was published. And that was not anticipated by Hausmann. It was a discovery. And building on that discovery, Mitu Giuletti, who's my colleague, is a lawyer at the University of Virginia and a contributor to my volume. He proposed to create an odiousness rating system for sovereign bonds. The idea is to flag debt at risk of being considered odious along the way, to flag to creditors that there would be an odiousness problem. So this rating system is controversial, and I can go back in the Q&A telling why it's controversial. But what matters is this. The doctrine is moving beyond legal theory and to become a tool that shapes investor behavior. And that's the first interesting shift happening in the doctrine of odious debt. The second shift I want to talk about is actually the shift I mentioned earlier about placing more blame onto lenders. Okay. Some historians, going back in history once again, some historians now argue that Alexander Sachs' treatise was actually less concerned with odious borrowers than with odious lenders. When you read the treatise, and I've read it so many times, the book actually discusses a very interesting case, the case of Costa Rica in the early 20th century. This is an interesting story, which I'm going to tell you right now. In 1917, General Tinoco, that's his name, took power in Costa Rica in a coup and ruled as a dictator for several years. When democracy was restored a few years later, the new government refused to honor several contracts signed under Tinoco, including a loan from the Royal Bank of Canada. The case ended up in international arbitration overseen by William Taft, who was a US president. At that time, he was the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court. And Taft, this is interesting, ruled in favor of Costa Rica, not because the regime was illegitimate, but because the loan had been fraudulent. The bank, he said, knew or should have known that the money was for Tinoco's personal use. This case is remarkable for many reasons, because it shows that you don't need a dictatorship for debt to be considered odious. What matters is whether the loan was abusive and whether the lender was complicit. And that's the core of what I call the Costa Rican formula, which is an alternative version of the doctrine that focuses on bad lending. And this formula is very interesting for us in the 21st century. This formula was applied recently in Ecuador. In 2008, Rafael Correa launched an audit that pointed to irregularities in loans. And based on that audit, the country claimed the debt was odious, and the country suspended payments, and it never repaid. So in Ecuador, lenders weren't funding a dictator, a tyrant. They were backing projects that turned out to be unnecessary and overpriced. And that's what makes this case, again, very important, because it shows that odious debt isn't just about despots and war crimes, it's also about irresponsible lending. That brings me to a key question I'm addressing in the paper. Can we regulate lending before it causes harm? That's a key question for markets right now, for international markets and for the international financial architecture. In the paper, I argue that it's not enough to protect states after the damage is done. We need to go further and start regulating predatory lending before countries become trapped in debt distress. And for that to work, we need proactive tools. And this is where the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, could play a central role. The IMF, as you know, steps in when countries cannot repay their debts. The IMF provides emergency funding, emergency financing, and in practice, it often ends up bailing out the creditors, as we know. But what if the IMF helped shift the rules? That's a key question. The IMF could condition its support on an evaluation on how the debt was contracted in the first place. Very simply, if a loan was granted under abusive or predatory conditions, well, the creditor shouldn't be bailed out. That's a key idea. To do that, the IMF could borrow common law principles from jurisdictions like New York and England. First, there is the principle of abuse of rights, which is recognized, which has legal standing. Courts can use it to void contracts tied to fraud or corruption, and the IMF could just do the same thing. Second, agency law is another principle. If a creditor knowingly grants a loan that a country cannot repay or that harms its people, well, the creditor should be held liable or co-responsible in the case of a default. In short, lenders shouldn't be legally detached from the social and economic consequences of their loans. And that's something that is under discussion right now as we speak in international finance. I want to finish this presentation with the case of Greece and by showing you how this would have played out in Greece during the last crisis in 2008. Actually, the crisis is still going on. It never ended. The country is burdened with a level of debt that the country will probably never repay. So the recent debt crisis in Greece shows how this might work in practice. Start with defense spending. For decades, it was a major driver in Greece's debt. If Greece had aligned its military budget with the European average, it would have saved nearly 150 billion euros over the years, enough to cover the first bailout. And as it turns out, many of those arms deals with French and German companies were corrupt. In 2015, a former Greek defense minister was jailed for taking bribes from German arms companies. Under anti-corruption principles, those contracts could have been voided. That's the first thing. Second thing, there is the infamous 2001 loan from Goldman Sachs. The US bank arranged a loan to help Greece hide part of its debt from European authorities. This is before the euro, okay? The deal was based on a complex formula that Greek officials reportedly didn't fully understand, and it ended up costing the country between 5 and 10 billion euros. That's a textbook case of abusive lending. And under fiduciary duty principles, agency law, Goldman Sachs could have been held accountable for part of the debt. Now, if the IMF had made it clear and signaled that it wouldn't bail out predatory creditors, those creditors might have backed off. That's the important. That's the reasoning behind my proposal. And Greece could have avoided billions in wasteful and harmful programs. Put it all together, you see a different picture of the Greek crisis. It wasn't just about bad decisions by the borrowers. Of course, Greece made a lot of bad decisions, but it wasn't just about that. It was also about predatory lending and self-interested creditors. And those behaviors could be and should be regulated under the revised version of Odious debt. And that's my talk.
Thank you so much. Yes, any questions?
Should I stop sharing my...
Pierre, this is Vivian. I have a question. Thank you. That was really interesting. Could the odious debt path that you're suggesting be misused? Have you thought through abuses that could occur by leaders who understood the two sides of your odious debt equation?
Are you talking about the Cuban formula, or just that in general?
Just in general, I think you know, I'm thinking of leaders who, once they know that they can somehow borrow and offload just purely by defining the two paths for having loan forgiveness, is there a possibility for abuse? It's a little bit like trying to write the you know, the U.S. Constitution. How do you set it up in such a way that abuse is kept to a minimum?
That's the problem of false positives in you know, an assessment of odious debt. If you push forward the concept, you might have, as you say, false positives. So cases which are not cases of debt which are not odious, but which are finally considered obvious for wrong reasons. And this you know, it all boils down to the criteria you need to set in place. So I didn't talk about the criteria, the discussion I have with my colleague Mitu Giolati about, you know, how you devise an odiousness a rating system, you know, so that you very specifically you go after intentions. You also trace the money, how it is used, because it's very complex. You know, when you look at a country, you have hundreds of billions of euros of money, and you need to trace whether each loan was correctly used or misused, you know, for purposes that support the interest of the population or go against the interest of the population. And that's, you know, it's at the core of the proposal. I'm not the only one in this story, but with lawyers, I'm a sociologist, political scientist. The idea is to come up with very precise criteria that would articulate very precisely this doctrine to make it effective without producing moral hazard, pretty much, because I think this is where you're going. So this is the engineering behind the proposal, and it's the subject or the object of a very technical reasoning about the criteria of odiousness.
Great. I have Gordon next, then Angela, and then Daphne.
Yes. Oh, damn it. Sorry. Thank you for the great talk. I'm personally very interested in the research on debt and debt cancellation. I've just published something on the CNRS, which is the French, well, the largest ever debt cancellation program. And I love the idea of odious debt being taken on board and having a rating system. And it is true that the IMF and the World Bank can change their mind, because in effect that was how multilateral debt began to be written off when the IMF and the World Bank came on board. So it is possible, but it doesn't strike me as being in international law as the most immediate step forward, because it's kind of the nuclear solution in some ways. And it really just, in a way, this is more of it's kind of a question, but it's how much consideration are you giving in this talk to interim solutions? Because obviously creditors don't even like to reschedule debt. They don't like to cancel it. They hate cancelling it. The whole international infrastructure is set up in a way which favours the creditor at the expense of the debtor, whether it's in the Paris Club or wherever. So all power is in the hands of the creditor, really. So I am hearing what you're saying, but to what extent are you taking into consideration the fact that most often, if people do decide to default, then there will be repercussions for the debtor. It's not always considered uh, a good thing to do. And then I suppose the kind of counterfactual, because I've studied a lot of African dictators who indebt their country, but quite often there comes a point when they cannot borrow any longer. So in this rating system, if it were to actually work, is there a danger that some countries that really need money will simply never be able to find a lender? And we see it on the personal front as well, with payday loans and so on. People who can't afford to go to the bank end up going to a payday lender, and so on. So, I mean, it's not really a question, but interim solutions that are less nuclear. And what about people who can't borrow money otherwise, if the odious debt criteria kick in? Sorry, I hope that's clear.
Right, we need to talk about C2D because those
Yeah.
are interesting tools where you can convert debt into investments as a way to provide debt relief. It's an interesting thing. Well, obviously, the change is immense. This is huge. The sovereign lending is totally deregulated. There is no regulation. That's a problem. There is no way to channel credit to the countries that need actually international credit. International credit it's not for all countries. You have other ways to finance your country than to go on international markets and raise billions, sometimes dozens of billions of dollars on in debt, in bonds. I'm just going to take the case of Ghana. Ghana is a small country. It's a fragile economy. It raised something close to $50 billion in external debt in a matter of 3 years, because bondholders thought, okay, let's pour money in this country because we know they will have to pay back. There is no risk. It's a riskless system, and that's a problem, and it encourages it creates moral problems, and that's the problem, and that's the meaning of my proposal. And of course, I'm not the only one thinking about this. We need to regulate credit, international credit. It's very important. For centuries, default was the regulatory principle. Actually, those interactions were regulated by default because country could exist. Country, they were not inhibited. They had no problem defaulting on their debt. So that was the principle under which financial behavior was regulated. International creditor were oftentimes reluctant to lend to a country because they knew they could lose everything. This is lost. There is no principle of regulation these days, and that encourages problems. So the concept of odious debt is actually a way to reintroduce regulation without going back to the era where countries repudiated their debt unilaterally. So it is a legal principle which can bring order into a very messy picture. Right now, the countries borrowers are the ones who suffer the cost of this mess because they are not allowed to default and they need to bear the cost of having too much debt. Lenders, they are off the hook right now. They profit from those asymmetries. Okay, so we need to reintroduce some kind of balance. Odious debt is one solution, provided that it can be used by the IMF, by multilateral institutions. Okay, I think it should be built into the multilateral international order. That's part of the solution. Now, I just want to address maybe the last thing you said. What about the countries that cannot access international markets? And there are some countries which cannot access international markets. But this is also because credit is misdirected. Some credit goes to countries that shouldn't borrow in international markets, or they borrow too much, you know. And this is all a matter of finding an equilibrium in international lending. And yeah, that's pretty much.
Can I over lunch, but not just now. We need to talk about the case of China, because of course
China, of course,
absolutely needs to be brought into your model. Otherwise, the deregulation is not going to work. But sorry, I'll stop there.
This is one of the main predatory lenders these days.
Yeah.
They
Thank
lend
you so
a
much.
lot of money to countries who don't necessarily need credit right now, especially in Africa. Thank you, Gordon. We need to speak more.
Thank you. And Dylan next.
That was really my question. I was reminded of connections or parallels with predatory lending. I was wondering if you would use that phrase in both the housing market prior to the 2008 financial crisis, and also in student debt in the US, in which, the lending system, the federal, student lending system, motivates predatory lenders to, to get students who aren't ready to go to college to take on massive debt. Often those students don't complete their degrees, but they're still on the hook for payments. So yeah, I was just wondering whether you might extend the notion of predatory lending from a domestic frame to an international frame.
Absolutely. The notion of predatory lending has legal standing in consumer law, also in corporate law. Corporations and individuals, people like you and me, if we take on too much debt, well, we are protected at some point. We don't go to jail anymore. We used to go to jail a few centuries ago. We don't go to jail anymore, and there are some limits placed on the continuity of debt contracts. If you cannot repay, you restructure your debt. There are some. There is a framework for that. Companies are protected by I forgot which title, the Title 9, or I forgot the bankruptcy law. There are bankruptcy laws in the US at the international level, but there is no such thing for states. That's a problem, and that's a weakness for states, because they're not protected. There is no international courts protecting states from creditors. So there is no limits placed on the continuity of that contract. So that's why it's very messy. So we need to actually emulate provisions coming from predatory lending and the problem of personal bankruptcy and corporate bankruptcy into the sovereign sector. I mean, that's my opinion, at least. But it's a tricky matter, because states are sovereign. States are not companies, and they are not individuals. So the question as to whether we can import for the good cause, I mean, whether we can import provisions coming from the private world to apply to the public world of sovereign states. This is a very controversial matter. But I mean, those are very big debates. There are other questions, so I see that David has his hands up.
Yes.
Thank you. It was a fascinating presentation. I'm not an expert at all of these matters, but I appreciated very much the final part about Greece, and which was, of course, a very tough topics for, well, for above all for any European citizen. And so I think that's a very good point. They want to shift the attention from borrowers to lenders. But as concerned the borrowers, if I mean maybe I missed something, but as I've got the fact to define a state, an odious borrower is also somehow a mean of political pressure. So finally, the question is who who is an odious borrower? Who decide that Cuba is an odious borrower and Turkey is not, for example? Who, I mean,
Sure. Well, this is we've been having this debate for quite almost a century now. Credit rating agencies, we know Moody's, we know Standard and Poor's, we know those agencies. They date back from the early 20th century in the U.S. and they rate debt sustainability, whether the issuer can repay the debt. So they have devised criteria for financial criteria for assessing whether the debt can be paid back. Rating systems have evolved during the 1970s and 1980s. The OECD, the IMF, now they rate the degree of political openness, of countries. They also rate all sorts of things like governance and stuff. The problem, of course, is they evaluate sovereign states, and they're not democratically elected. The problem with OECD, the problem with the IMF, and everything. So the rating system I'm thinking about is actually poses the same problems because the people who would be in charge of rating the odiousness of the debt of a country wouldn't be democratically elected. And that poses a lot of problems. In terms of Venezuela, this is something I talked about with my colleague Mitu Giolati. The problem is, so Venezuela, is it a dictatorship? Probably yes. Was it a dictatorship under the previous president? Probably not, because he was democratically elected. So, I mean Chavez. And there are huge debates about how you characterize the despotic or democratic character of the government of a country. So with Me Too, we thought about this, and he's actually an expert in this. You can actually have a rating system which is not black or white, despotic or democratic. You can have different shades, in a spectrum of position. And also you can have several rating systems, just as in the rating industry, you have we know Moody's, we know Fitch, we know Standard and Poor's. It's not just one rating system. Just as the IMF has a rating system which is different from the World Bank, and the World Bank is different from OECD. So, and those rating systems don't necessarily align. And China has its own rating system. So the idea behind those ratings is to have a plural world or ecology of rating systems, so that you introduce competition and you introduce diversity into the objective world of rating. So that's the idea behind the proposal. It's not just to have one system with one team responsible for determining whether a country is democratic or despotic. But I agree with you. Those are challenging questions. Those are very challenging questions.
I think that the question is not only that the rating agency are not democratically elected, it's that they are private companies that have their own business. So I think that, I mean, in principle, the only issue that can decide this is the United Nations.
Well, I mean, I remember I was with some colleagues from Germany. We had the idea of having a non-profit rating organization a couple of years ago during the European debt crisis, when we had a real problem with those U.S. rating agencies, Moody's and Standard and Poor's. We had the idea of having a non-profit rating agency in the business and not business of rating countries. And I think this is an interesting solution for this odiousness rating. We cannot have a for-profit rating agency which actually takes fees from countries or companies to issue the ratings. We have a problem, and this is a problem we had during the subprime debt crisis. Those rating agencies being funded by the banks, the very banks they were supposed to evaluate. So we had a conflict of interest. So a non-profit rating agency would be, of course, at the governance level, a solution to think about. Thank you, David.
All right. Thank you. This is the time we have for this segment. Thank you so much, Professor PÉNET, for your presentation and everyone for the questions.